Perhaps you put Welt, or maybe it's your target 5-star that you really like and really want to get, and want to figure out like what kind of team comms he works very well in so that he can fulfill his maximum potential. And welcome back to the channel if you guys are revisiting, and for those of you who are new here, we'll be talking first about the free-to-play team comms for Welt so that everyone can be able to use him somewhat, and we will slowly add a little bit more gacha on, and towards the end with more of the whale team comms. But do stick around even if you're free to play to the end, as I'll be talking a lot of concepts in terms of how to build team comms, which I think a lot of you will find useful, especially when the game goes on and more characters are added into the game. These concepts can be applied as well. Now let's first talk about the free-to-play team comm, and the first character I think works really well with Welt is definitely Esther. And the reason for that is because Esther offers an AoE speed buff to your team, while Welt is mainly speed downing the enemy team in an AoE fashion across the board. So what this means is you buff your team up and you bring the enemy speed down, the speed differential is increasingly magnified. So in a sense, they amplify each other's strengths and what they do to really make your team move much quicker as well. So with a speed up and speed down characters on the team, you can choose then to opt for a damage dealer in the third slot. For example, maybe Serval or Danheng. And in the last slot, you definitely would like more of a free-to-play character, a defensive character rather, like Fire MC or Natasha. Now some things to consider is these two already do decent amounts of AoE damage, not tremendously a lot but good enough, and with Fire MC you do add a bit more to that AoE damage point. In this sense, Danheng definitely will be a lot better for your team since he adds to that single damage component. Of course, if you're running like a character like Natasha, who is really more of a healer and doesn't really offer as much AoE damage, Serval could be pretty good, especially when you have so much movement speed buffing your team. She can act really fast as well to emphasize on her very high attack base stat to combo with Esther. Not really a complete team as you can see because you are using 3 slots for more supportive options. That's why your DPS options are limited, but this will be very easily solved as we add more gacha into the mix. So once you add gacha, I think a character that will benefit from this team quite greatly will be a character like Hook. Hook plays very well with Esther, and her main downside is actually she's a very slow character, but she does a lot of damage and has a very good amount of base attack as well. These 3 are all triple fire, so you get to capitalize quite well on Esther's fire damage bonus, speed bonus as well as attack bonus, and really strong all around. You have good single target damage from Hook and decent amount of AoE from Welt, Fire MC, and a little bit on Esther as well. So I think this will be an interesting team to run a triple fire into a Welt team. Although you don't have healing, you could always swap out Natasha over Fire MC if you really wanted to. Really, a lot of characters can fill up this slot because they all benefit from attack buffs as well as being much quicker than the enemy. Characters that won't really benefit are like characters that want the enemy to attack them. March 7 might not benefit as much, or a character like Clara, which we will talk about later on as well, because these kind of characters want the enemy to inherently attack the unit that is being buffed so that they can counter attack as well. If you want to play Tingyun here, the only downside is you don't get this massive speed differential with Esther and Welt, because they really work, synergize really well together, and Tingyun just doesn't offer that. So I would say that some of you are asking cheekily like what kind of situations Tingyun doesn't excel in. This is an example of one of them, where the speed from Esther really makes a much bigger difference compared to the energy restoration that Tingyun offers. Still, both of them are really good characters as well. Alright, so now let's talk about the whale team comm, and what do I mean by whale is really anything more than 2 5-star characters, which I would say is pretty difficult to get, especially if you're a total free-to-play and a day 1 player, or you're really just brand new, maybe your first week in and stuff like that. So I want to talk first about a character that we briefly mentioned, and that is Clara. I think the weakness of Clara is that when your enemies move slower, generally you will hit Clara or be able to counter attack much less. The downside of this is, of course, her damage potential is significantly reduced as well. Of course, you could always play a team like Welt into Clara, and maybe you can even run a character like Pella to defense break the whole enemies to emphasize the amount of damage. This team I think will also be really strong, and of course, last slot you could always run Natasha in this comp if you really wanted to force these 2 characters to play together. But I do think that it's better to drop Welt and this team if you really just want to play Clara. I've already done a Clara video, so you guys can check it out if you are interested as well. And instead of playing a character like Clara in this slot, in this team comp, A character like Himiko might work really well here. Since you get that speed down on the whole team, you get a AoE defense break, and you have Himiko who does a tremendous amounts of AoE damage. Really like a cleave team where you really try to one-shot the enemy and prevent them from getting many turns. Of course, the downside of this is you won't be able to have a character like Asta who gives a lot of fire buffing to Himiko as well as attack buffs. Rather, you're focusing more on like a defense shred, speed down, preventing the enemy from doing much kind of strategy. In this sense, maybe you can even consider putting Asta here instead of Pella. Yanqing offers very strong single target damage and is pretty independent. He pops off very early on because of his very high crit rate passives that he gets as well. So when you play a character like Yanqing, you generally want your opponents to not be able to attack you as often because his passive happens when he's not getting attacked. Welt is very good for that because Welt slows the enemy down, making them inherently act much less than you. You can play Asta here as he benefits a lot from Asta's speed buff to have that speed differential, as well as the attack buff as well to do more damage. In terms of AoE, you might be a little bit lacking, especially if Welt is not built for a lot of AoE damage and maybe he's not geared as well, but I still think that they do offer enough here, and you can play Natasha or maybe Fire MC in the last slot as well. Now the downside of Bronya versus Asta here is Asta gives speed buff to the whole team while Bronya increases the speed of 1. So if you are playing like a hyper carry role, perhaps with a very strong single target like maybe Zila or maybe Yanqing, this will be really strong because you have something to focus on. But generally, if you are, for example, boosting up your whole team and wanting the damage to come from your whole team, which generally happens the later you get into the game, then this Bronya might start to fall off in terms of her pairing with Welt. But in the early game, like let's say you're just running maybe Danheng here and you're just running these 3 characters, you'll be really strong for Bronya to bump up Danheng and he slows the enemy down. But then again, you have slow here, you have slow here, might not be really advisable, but I think it still can see some play. Overall, I do prefer Asta over Bronya for the fact of the AoE speed differential that we mentioned earlier on in this video. When you have Gepard and Welt, inherently what is implying is you are trying to make the enemy do nearly no damage to your team, which means you can actually forego another defensive unit and just run like a double attacker Serval here to give you very strong AoE damage. Susang, you can play Danheng. It's more like a controller team rather than a damage dealing team. But for now, as we see in terms of like the memory of chaos and simulated universe and stuff like that, it's more of a DPS check oriented in the early game or the early stages of Honkai Star Rail rather than compared to trying to resist a lot of damage. So if we do ever get a team that or a map that deals a lot of damage but doesn't have that turn requirement, a team like this will be pretty effective as well, especially with these 2 core units, and you can run most units in the other 2 slots. Bailu is going to be a real strong character for healing, but in this sense, if your enemies are not really dealing that much damage to you, because if you think about it, Welt is already like semi-defensive. By slowing the enemies down, essentially you are kind of protecting your team by letting the enemies attack less. And for those of you who don't know, when imaginary characters break weaknesses, the enemies actually get pushed back and slowed as well. It's, in a sense, if you think about it, it's already a slightly defensive character to play. Bailu offers a tremendous amount of healing, which might not really be necessary, especially when the enemies might not be taking as many turns. Lota on the other hand is very different because Lota also offers an imaginary element to both of them. By running 2 imaginary characters, you actually open up your team composition to running Silver Wolf, who excels at implanting weaknesses based on the composition of your team. You can easily run, for example, Qingque here or Zila here and get that double quantum, double imaginary. For those of you who are unfamiliar with like weakness breaking of quantum and imaginary both delay the enemy's speed, so it's a very strong control team already. And Lota is an offensive healer. He does the most damage from an offensive position, either Qingque or Zila depending on how much money you have, and of course whether you need more AoE damage and whether you have skill points to spare as well. Blade is a very unique character because he's very independent. By being independent means that he can fit into most team that requires some sort of AoE situation, but the downside of Blade is he generally manipulates his life. So it's going to be tricky for a new player to adjust around Blade, but if you are slightly more experienced and you know how to handle the manipulation of his HP bar, I think that this team, Husbando team comp right here, well, Blade Lotar is really strong. And of course, when you already have good healing, will work really well with Blade. You have slowing the enemy, you have tons of control. You might even consider going for like an AoE debuffer here to just emphasize a lot more on Blade's damage on the overall enemy team. This team is already pretty strong as you have heals, slows, you have imaginary, you have wind as well, you have ice, and Pela's ice damage is pretty okay as well. So really strong team. If you want to run a Husbando team, I highly recommend you playing something like this. You could of course run a character like Jingyuan in this slot instead. As you can really see, Welt is such a versatile character. He can be played in most team comps, but he works best of course with teams that utilize on AoE speed in terms of differential, want to move a bit faster, and works of course better with slightly more AoE teams as it really capitalizes on his ability to speed down the whole of the enemy team, rather than of course maybe a character like Danheng who already does that speed down on one single character. That's what differentiates him from Danheng as well. When you run Kafka together with Welt, you are enabling her to use her passive more often relative to the enemy, especially when you pair it with a character like Asta, who gives you that speed buff and attack buff throughout the party as well. In the third slot, you can run like a defensive unit here and you have pretty good amounts of AoE damage. The only thing that you might be lacking of course is a bit of single target damage. But if you really wanted to, you could always add in, for example, a single target damage dealer in the last slot. And because Welt is so flexible, his best team is very difficult to pinpoint on, but I'm gonna just say this. In terms of, I think what is his best team is a role that he plays that no other character really fulfills really well, and that is definitely with a character like Jingyuan. Firstly, Jingyuan is AoE. He benefits from the AoE speed down that Welt provides compared to Danheng, as well as Lightning Lord doesn't benefit from speed up, so speed down is tremendously valuable for a character like Jingyuan. And in this case, because he doesn't really benefit from Esta's speed up as much in terms of Lightning Lord, you could run Esta to get an overall team differential if you are running like more offensive units in the 4th slot, but Tingyun is also able to be played in this case because she works really well with Jingyuan already. Both of these characters combo together really well for a double Lightning team. Your last slot can be depending on what kind of floor you are in. You could always run Luota for a more offensive 4th slot. You could run a healer as well, for example Natasha or defensive characters in this slot as well. But in my opinion, I think if you don't really need that much defensive ability because the enemies are already moving so slow, or perhaps you're running Asta here to make your team just move so much faster, you could even consider running a double hyper carry strat together with a double speed up and speed down. And if you like such videos, do like and subscribe for more of such content, and check out these 2 other team composition videos right here as well. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next video.